Hi, I'm Karen Wong at The Meaning Code. We're exploring the universe to find the metaphors that uncover the hidden reality. The truth is out there, just waiting for you. And today we're going to be talking with Jason, who has a new idea about a new kind of power. So if you like the content, click the like button and subscribe so that we reach more listeners and viewers. And I look forward to talking to Jason. Welcome, Jason. It's good to have you here at The Meaning Code.
Hi, Karen. Thanks for having me. I've been looking forward to this.
So I would love to hear a little bit about your life and maybe give us a little bit of background on how you came to the place you are now.
Yep. Okay. So perhaps from my accent, people can tell that I'm from South Africa, although I've been in Australia for the last 14 years. So I've been accused of sounding a bit like an Aussie by people back in South Africa. So we keep changing as we move along, right? So I was grew up in apartheid South Africa on a farm, about an hour's drive from Capetown, and grew up as a Afrikaans-speaking child, and the only person I spoke English to was my mum. I went to a primary school of 50 kids. We had a big class of 13, so that was a big deal. And
lucky number.
Yeah. And then I went off to a boarding school in the city. And I still vividly remember my first day at assembly, just with this hall filled with 650 kids, and I was very nervous about life in the big city, having come from a very small community. So I was always interested in academics and maths specifically. So I remember going through. I was always going to be an engineer until my last 6 months in high school. I got the panic and thought, maybe I need to explore other avenues as well. So I looked at computer science and actuarial science, and in the end, couldn't make up my mind, so I just settled for engineering, which was my first love. So anyway, I can say that I considered what I was going to do. I didn't just fall into it. So then I went off to University of Capetown and studied mechanical engineering. And then in third year, I remember I invited my father over to the faculty to just come and look at the campus and see what I've been up to for the last several years. And I remember telling him over a cup of coffee that I'd changed my mind and I wanted to go farming. So Dad took it very well, and he very calmly suggested that perhaps I finish my degree and work for several years as an engineer before making the decision, which was what I proceeded to do. So I ended up working in engineering for about 7 years, and then followed the dream and moved back to the farm, which was at that stage a couple of years after the new South Africa, the release of Mandela, and the first fully democratic elections in South Africa. At which time a lot of people were leaving South Africa. There was a lot of flux. Some people were leaving, others were coming back, depending on their view of what the good was and wasn't. So obviously we took a bet to stay in South Africa. And then, but prior to that, while I was working at Caltex, I had two jobs there. One was as a project engineer, doing, installing modifications and upgrades to the refinery, which was exciting and high pressure, and Ultimately, not my cup of tea. So I then moved over to head office. I got a promotion and became a fuels specialist, which was a bit odd for a mechanical engineer, but one never stops learning, and that was all very interesting. Which also, I think, underpins, because I've been interested in energy. I think most engineers possibly are interested in energy in one form or the other, because it pretty much drives everything that we do at the end of the day. So prior to me leaving for head office, I was we were twiddling our thumbs after our last major shutdown and project completion, waiting for the chemical engineers to dream up the next round of modifications and upgrades. And a contractor that I'd used was just walked past my cubicle and dropped something on my desk and gave me a thumbs up and a smile and wandered off. And this had led to what turned out to be a 26-year journey of fun and exploration, and really trying to figure out how the world works ultimately, because it's been a fun journey. So what I was given.
Okay, now you've totally got my curiosity activated here. He dropped something on your desk, and for 26 years you've been following the trail. So
yes,
I hope you're going to reveal what it is.
That's the plan. That's the plan. So he it was a set of rare earth magnets. It was a thank you for work done, and it was just a small set of magnets about an inch long and 20 millimeters in diameter. It's the first time I'd seen these new, more powerful rare earth magnets. So I ended up having a play with them, and it was maybe a week, and I'd figured out a few things, and led me to conceptualizing what I think is correctly termed a Curie point heat engine, which is essentially that one can manipulate the magnetic field between the two magnets by having a material that's ferromagnetic properties changes with temperature. So for those that don't know this, iron is a ferromagnetic material, and that's a fairly high temperature. I think it's about 600 degrees C, but it might be 800. I'm a bit fuzzy on this. It loses that property, and it becomes what is called paramagnetic, which essentially means that you can no longer induce a magnetic field in the iron. Now that's a very high temperature, and actually at those high temperatures, if magnets are exposed to that, they would actually lose their magnetic properties generally. So, but what I discovered was that there is a material called gadolinium, which has a Curie temperature, which is the temperature at which this flip happens from when it becomes ferromagnetic or paramagnetic. Has a Curie point of 20 degrees C, which is around about ambient temperature. So what that means is that below 20 degrees C, gadolinium is in fact ferromagnetic and will be attracted to a magnet if it approaches it, because you get a magnetic field induced into the gadolinium. What that allows one to do is to, if you have this gadolinium at around about 2.5, 3 millimeters thick, and you place it against the north pole of one magnet, you can approach the north pole of another magnet to that piece of gadolinium, and it will not experience a net force. You could then heat up the gadolinium to above 20 degrees C, and now the gadolinium becomes magnetically inert, and now these magnets can repel each other and do work. So I was very excited at the time. I thought, wow, this is, this is a potentially, perpetual motion machine and all of this, because I didn't fully understand yet how that property was induced, or how that property came to be at different temperatures inside the gadolinium. But as I would later discover, that the strength of the ferromagnetism is proportional to temperature. So it's not a switch that gets flicked on and off. It is a gradual strengthening of the field. However, I did not know that at the time. I tried to source, this was back in 1993. In South Africa, I tried to source gadolinium, and this was pre-internet, obviously. I was unable to do that with my limited resources. I proceeded to move to head office for a couple of years, and then ended up following up on the dream and going to the farm, and this all got forgotten. And then in 2003, we took the decision to sell the farm, and that led me to, it was a traumatic time for me. The farm wasn't mine; it was left in a family trust, and I'd been managing the farm for 7 years, and had plans to, we'd planned to sell some of the farm, retain the rest, which I had envisaged to spend my life farming the place. But let's just say that various that plans never work out as you foresee them. So when we sold the farm, an offer was made on a larger piece that we intended. That offer was much higher than the agricultural value of the farm, and the family had to be considered, etc., etc. So the piece that was remaining ended up being really not viable to farm. So, so this upended my life's dream, as it were, and I was sort of tipped into some existential chaos, because I'd been out of engineering for 7 years. Didn't really want to do that again, because I enjoyed the freedom of farm life. And of course, we were living in South Africa, where things were starting to backslide somewhat. This was now 9 years after the end of apartheid, and the euphoria from the Mandela years had receded to the practical realities of trying to bring about a new South Africa and rectifying the wrongs of the past, all of that. And it was proving to be tougher than everyone had hoped, I suppose, is probably the best way of putting it. Is everything okay with the volume?
Yeah, sorry.
Okay. Yep, no, all good. Anyway, so I was suddenly without anything to do, living in the local town, and wondering what the future held. And as that process unfolded, I remembered the project. And during this time, my wife had suggested that we look at Australia, which she had a brother there. So we flew over to Tasmania, fell in love with it, and decided to take the plunge and move our young family over. We had 3 children at the time. I still have 3 children, and and we were just about to turn 40, which is a sort of cutoff from a migration point of view to to Australia, Canada, and New Zealand, they have similar sort of point systems. So once you become too old, they don't want you anymore. So we had to decide fairly quickly what we wanted to do. So we decided to take the plunge, and then so we applied for the visas required, and then we were sort of thrown in limbo for a bit over a year, waiting for this approval process. So during this time, I was reminded of my original game that I'd been playing with the magnets, and the idea that I'd had. And my wife had another brother in Vancouver who I'd shared this idea with, and he was able to source some gadolinium in Vancouver. So we detoured from one of our holidays in Hawaii, detoured to Vancouver, picked up some gadolinium, carried this little parcel back to South Africa, and I then proceeded to test the concept, which proved to actually function as envisaged. The problem was, and I'd also bought a textbook at the time, and was studying up on this property, and then I'd learned, of course, that oh dear, that the gadolinium needed to be made particularly cold in order for this effect to be of any practical benefit. So we were looking at having to cool the gadolinium down to about minus 50 degrees or thereabouts in order to build something that could generate a practically useful amount of power. So the idea would then be is that the temperature of the gadolinium would oscillate from, say, minus 50 to 20 degrees C, so a 70-degree temperature swing, which would then allow these magnets to basically, if you could picture a piston engine made out of magnets and a cylinder head made out of gadolinium, and then you're fluctuating the temperature of the gadolinium. You could then, or not so much a cylinder head, rather as a sliver of material between two opposing pistons, really. You could then make a slow rotation engine with high torque, which could do some work. So the problem was the minus 50 degrees C, right? So, but as we were,
becomes probably almost as much as your output at that point, right?
Yeah. So obviously, if you have to generate the minus 50 using some kind of refrigeration device, you're going to end up with a net loss, right? Because there's no such thing as a free lunch, and whatever energy you put in plus the losses that you inevitably incur in real life, you end up with an interesting idea that would be a net loss and not go any further. So one needed a natural source of coal. So of course, at this time we were flying to Australia, we were flying to Vancouver, and flying to Hawaii, and one notes that at cruising altitude, that you've got between minus 30 and minus 50 degree outside temperatures, sort of Mount Everest altitude. So then I thought, well, okay, so you've got to build a 10-kilometer tall structure in order to access minus 50 degrees C. And yes, if you could do that, you could do this anywhere on Earth, and you could build this machine. Of course, I didn't mention that to anyone because you don't want to be laughed at. So that was just a thought experiment, and that's where I got stuck. I mentioned earlier that I'd had a bit of an existential crisis on the sale of the farm, which ended up being rather important to this whole process of discovery, because I ended up it was about 2004 when I conceptualized this 10-kilometer tall structure, and that really should have been the end of it, because that was then and still is today a practical impossibility to turn that into anything useful. However, when I came back from Tasmania, I actually went back for a second trip with my brother-in-law from Vancouver, who was at a loose end, and we went to Tasmania together with a view of purchasing a property. This was during the time when that property bubble was going on all around the world, and whilst we were in Tasmania for the first time, my wife and I, we noticed that the prices of properties were going up in the short time that we were actually there. So we thought, oh, if it takes a year for us to get there, would we even still be able to afford to buy a property in Australia? So I went with my brother-in-law, and that's how he got to hear about the project and ended up helping me source the gadolinium. Anyway, on our return, my wife handed me this book. She said, "Oh, this is a great book. You've got to read this." And it was Dan Brown's Da Vinci Code, which very interestingly ended up being the start of a weird series of synchronicities and coincidences and whatever else one might want to call it. I won't elaborate on that now. I just mentioned that because I kept getting nudges from behind the veil or the ether or whatever one wants to call it, because I never gave up on trying to solve this problem. Although I essentially got stuck in 2005 and made no further material progress until very recently. But I never gave up, because it was a lot of very, very unusual things that are just beyond what I've determined to be beyond the bounds of any reasonable probability in terms of, and I will definitely expand on that later, providing this idea turns into something useful. So perhaps I should focus.
Let me just throw in here something for people who've watched some of my previous conversations. Yeah. There is a philosopher by the name of Esther Lightcap Meek, and she bases her work on the work of a guy by the name of Brent Lonergan, and I think N.T. Wright has also done some work on this idea. But the idea is about how do we know anything, and her concept is that the way that we know anything is that there are actually little, she doesn't use this word, but the way I conceptualize it is little gifts that are out in front of us in the epistemic field, and they're there for us to receive. If we take that gift in, then in the process of beginning to know or to understand or integrate that knowledge into us, we build a relationship with it. And it's that all knowing is somehow relational with these little gifts that are put out there in front of us. I think that's quite a beautiful idea.
Well, I've been thinking about this, obviously, and just to just repeat what we spoke of prior to the recording, is that this journey has led me to Peterson, Van der Clay, and your own and many other channels, because I've been trying to figure out how this all works, because I've just been befuddled by it. And I was doing this I've been doing this for years, ever since Peterson arrived on the scene. That was probably about 6 months after I started looking, after I discovered YouTube as a source for, as an educational resource. Prior to Peterson, I was listening a bit to Alan Watts and Terence McKenna. And I dropped them in a hurry once I discovered Peterson, because with Peterson, obviously there's a lot of science behind what he was saying, and I was just blown away by the guy's knowledge, and everything that he was saying just rang true to me, and gelled with my own experience. So the mere fact that I'm on here, but this invention, which has now been turned into a patent, thanks perhaps to your prodding in a previous attempted interview, I decided, it seemed like the logical thing to do after some consideration and prompting from yourself. I have a prior invention and patent that I filed in Australia, so I got a bit jaded by the whole experience, and I thought, perhaps I won't bother this time. But anyway, so yeah, so sorry, Karen, if you don't mind putting a link to Esther Lightcap's Meek, just one of her works or book titles or something, in the comments section, that'll be great. And just to finish on that idea, I've actually been wondering whether the Easter egg hunt doesn't, in fact, sort of model that idea. You know, where one hides gifts for children out in the garden or somewhere around the house, and then parents give vague clues as to where to go searching. Is, in a sense, as been my idea, is that you get these synchronicities and coincidences are little nudges to follow the trail. That's been my experience, and that's the part that's puzzled me and why I ended up. So I just wondered whether the Easter egg hunt, one possible interpretation of that might be that very experience, is that, yeah, if you listen to the whispers, you will find the gifts, as it were.
That's a terrific image, and one of the images that has run through my mind, just based on our contemporary world, is the way the algorithm works. Because sometimes I'll be on the trail of something, and the algorithm will keep popping up these things that seem completely unrelated to me. But if I follow whichever one looks interesting to me, even though it's unrelated to my idea, when I start listening to it, there's all these pegs that fit together, and it's like, how does that happen?
Correct, and that is you've just described my experience to a T on YouTube and Google searching, etc. So
yeah.
So whether that's purely the algorithm or whether there's something else operating, nudging the algorithm, who would ever know?
Well, I mean, but the algorithm is just one illustration of it. We see the same thing happening in our lives just through experiences that we have.
Yes.
And a good example of this is the other day I was listening to Roger Penrose talk about his theory of his twister theory with Eric Weinstein on the podcast The Portal. And Penrose is talking about, he kind of, over the course of the interview, lays out all these little things that happened to him in the last 20, 30 years. Odd little things, like he just happened to be riding to the airport in the same car with a person who happened to have a piece of information that he needed. And then he was sitting next to somebody else at dinner one night who happened maybe to say something about his wife or something, but it made the light go off in his head. And all these little pieces came into place because of experiences, totally phenomenologically, not any algorithm, you know.
Yes. Yeah. Look, and in an essence, you know, a computer or the technology built into our PCs are like lower order renditions of human intelligence, and so the algorithm is a lower order reflection on a particular aspect of realities. Might be a valid way of looking at it.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right.
So back to you had discovered Jordan Peterson and realized that his ideas were based on science and they completely rang true with you.
Yep. Yeah. So that led me right to you, talking to you today, or to previously, and then to today. And yeah, so just to perhaps, so we ended up in Australia. I've always been a little bit of an introvert, so I didn't know what to do. I tried to find work as an engineer, and it never ever entered my head to go and retrain. Don't know why. So I started a business which had been what I'd done to get to move to the family farm. While my father was still farming, I started a cement brick and block, cinder block business, or whatever you call it in America. We had some quarries in the farm, so I used those natural resources to give me a slight edge in the competition. So that's what I did to start to move to the farm, and that business ran through until we sold the farm. So because I couldn't get work as an engineer, I thought, what now? Better stick with what I know. So I started this business in Australia, in Tasmania. It never really took off, but it sort of limped along for several years. But then when the big crash happened after the bubble, that put an end to it. And during this time, I was still working on the project on and off during free time, made no material progress, but the synchronicities kept happening. So that kept the thing going. And my wife was working for a business at the time in an office manager's position, and because the crash had happened, they lost some staff. I'd forgotten what a customer looked like. I was sitting in my own business, just stressing and worried. And so my wife texted me one day to mention that 2 people had just quit the office, and do I want a job as a salesperson? So I said, I'll see you tomorrow. I shuttered the business and started work for this company, which had a division which dealt with solar panels, solar hot water, and air conditioners, or in Tasmania, being a cold climate, we refer to them as heat pumps or reverse cycle air conditioners, which is actually their technically correct name. So I started in sales, and I very quickly thought, I wonder why no one has combined a reverse cycle air conditioner and a solar hot water system. Which that idea then led to me sometime later, together with a work colleague, coming up with a patent to improve the performance of a air conditioner in heating mode when it's running in reverse cycle mode, and that's to use that was to preheat the air onto the back of the unit that's situated outside, in order to make it less susceptible to freezing and to make it operate more efficiently. So we were very excited at the time, and we were going to take this global, and it all looked very good on paper. The problem is that we were in an arms race with essentially the air conditioning industry, and homes in Australia were being they were upgrading the insulation standard on homes in Australia at the time. So the heating costs were coming down all the time, both from more efficient air conditioners, and the actual load in the house was being reduced with better thermal insulation. So by the time that we were fairly close to taking this to market, we'd realized that the payback period for this invention was probably going to be over 10 years. So we decided that it wasn't smart to launch a new business with a product where the payback numbers were not that obvious. Now, so in the meantime, I was offered the opportunity to become a refrigeration mechanic at the age of 50. I went in, or 49 at the time. I did a mature age retraining, and this was it about 2013, so about 9 years after we landed in Australia. I realized, I'm not on the scrap heap, I can actually learn something new. And so I was offered this opportunity, which I grabbed like a drowning man. So I'm now a qualified refrigeration mechanic. As we were talking about, following. I was actually I'd almost completed a online teaching degree to become. When my business started failing, I signed on with the University of Tasmania with a view to becoming a high school maths and physics teacher. And I was actually signed up for my very last block, which was a 3-month block in a school to get direct teaching experience, when I was offered the opportunity to become a refrigeration mechanic. And I didn't realize quite how stressed I was by the prospect of becoming a teacher, because the relief that flooded over me when I was given this alternative just said it all. I realized that I hadn't that I didn't actually want to be a teacher. I was doing it out of necessity in order to generate an income. But what my experience in the classroom was interesting, because I grew up. My formative school years were in the 70s and early 80s, and I'd heard about how things had changed in the classroom, but my direct experience in government schools in Tasmania was quite an eye-opener, and I realized that student control was a fraught. Sounds terrible. Teacher-student relations was somewhat different to what I'd remembered them to be. So that was part of the angst that had been building up in me. I think I mentioned previously I was a bit of an introvert, so that those two bits of information is probably all that one needs to realize that this was a bit nerve-wracking for me. Anyway, so I was.
It seems like the refrigeration mechanic thing would be a much better fit with all this stuff that you're thinking about, though.
Well, precisely. So this was. I hadn't mentioned these ideas to anyone outside of my wife. So life offered me this opportunity. I grabbed it, not realizing at the time that it was connected at all to this just little side hobby that had been occupying some of my spare time over the years. And it turns out that the invention and the patent was actually a key step towards. So this patent that I just briefly mentioned, to preheat the air onto the outdoor unit of an air conditioner, that was the final missing element required for this new idea. So perhaps I should launch into the idea now.
Yes, that sounds great.
Enough sketching of the background. So I've had a bit of fun with this, because obviously it's been a long process. So I've sort of, when I introduce it, when I'm going to tell someone about this thing, I sort of say something like, I've figured out how to turn Mount Everest upside down without having to build a 10-kilometer tall structure, or conversely, how to make it snow in the Sahara in midsummer with no energy input and and actually not adding any water to the to what already exists in the atmosphere. So I was just going about my daily tasks. Sorry, the one other thing I left out was I've taken a hiatus away from refrigeration. And my wife and I have been living in Sydney for the last year to just explore different avenues in life, and also in order to fund our daughter's education as a ballerina in London. My wife got quite a good job opportunity in Sydney. And I followed her here just to see how things would go. So I've been working as a storeman and delivery driver for a year. And I was just going about in the store, just doing my job when this idea just materialized in late November last year. And not that I've commented much on your videos or anyone else's, because for some reason or other, I'm just too lazy to sign in. So generally when I'm on YouTube, I'm not signed in, so I'm just incognito. But I've been watching pretty much every Vanderklay video and yours and others, and I was on the Discord server. I've stopped commenting there now, just because I've been focusing on trying to progress this idea. But anyway, so this idea just dropped into my head fully formed. It's like, wow, okay, so what you can do in order to make something really cold is the atmosphere has this property called the lapse rate, which is the reduction in temperature with altitude, which is why we needed to look at building a 10-kilometer tall structure in order to access minus 50 degrees C. But it turns out that the lapse rate functions as a linear movement of air through the atmosphere, and that one can mimic a 10-kilometer tall structure by having 10 1-kilometer tall structures or 20 half-kilometer tall structures, and by thermally coupling the top of the first structure to the base of the second structure. In other words, if we build a 1-kilometer structure and put a heat exchange at the top of that and use a hydronic circuit. So let's initially just talk about water. So you have a heat exchange at the top of tower A and coupled to a heat exchange at the base of tower B. Cold water sinks and warm water rises. So anyone who's swum in a farm dam or a river, or even in the ocean, if you'll dive, scuba diving, once you go sort of 20 meters down, there's a marked temperature difference in the water 20 meters down to the warm surface water, because warm water is less dense than cold water. So cold water sinks, warm water rises. And this principle has been used in solar hot water systems around the world for 50, 60, 70 years. And that is called the thermosiphon effect. So if you place your solar hot water collector below the solar water tank.
I'm having trouble connecting to the internet. Take a look at the help section in your Alexa.
Sorry. You must have said something that triggered this thing.
Okay.
Okay, I put it on mute.
Right.
Okay, so we were talking about the thermosiphon?
Yes. Okay. So, so I think I probably don't need to insult the intelligence of your audience. I will just leave it that thermosiphon is a real effect. It is utilized in solar hot water cylinders and works on the principle that warm water is less dense than cold water. So warm water rises, cold water sinks. So by having two adjacent towers, you can transport the cold from the top of the tower A to the base of tower B without actually having to put a pump into that circuit and circulate the water. It will
Okay, so let me just clarify. So is it water becoming, is it air becoming colder as it goes up, and then there's water at the top, and then that water is cooled, and then that cool water goes down?
Yeah. So initially, the first tower can just be a pole. So the air 1 kilometer up is 10 degrees colder than the air at the base. This lapse rate, which basically works on the expansion of air, that it's governed by the ideal gas laws. So air pressure at ground level is higher than at altitude, and that higher pressure translates to a higher temperature. This is high school maths. Anyone who's interested in this effect can just Google the adiabatic lapse rate. There's a lot of information about this online. And that essentially explains why Mount Everest is always well below freezing. So this adiabatic lapse rate explains why when you look at the outside, when they display the outside conditions when you're flying in an aeroplane, how as you're gaining in altitude, how the outside temperature is decreasing as you go up in altitude. And that is essentially governed by the fact that the high altitude air is at a much lower pressure. It has expanded, and therefore its temperature correspondingly drops. That's governed by the ideal gas law. So structure A can just, for the sake of this thought experiment, can just be a pole with a heat exchanger on top of it sitting in air that is, so structure A is, for argument's sake, 1 kilometer tall. The top of the pole is then 10 degrees colder than the base of the pole. And that is sufficient, that temperature difference is sufficient to auto-circulate the water. So the warm water, the surface water is warmer than the water at altitude, so it rises to the top, and conversely on the other side of the circuits, the cold water wants to fall down to the bottom because it's heavier than the water in the bottom heat exchanger. So you get this effect. So both sides of this hydraulic circuit are moving to circulate the water in the same direction. So we can now transfer water to a bottom heat exchanger at ground level, which is now 10 degrees cooler than the air. So now we can cool the air at the base of Tower B down to a very close down to a similar temperature to what the air was at the top of Tower A. We have one problem though, and that is that cold air wants to sink and not rise. So now we have to repeat the same motion, and we have to put near the top of Tower B, we put another heat exchanger, which is then linked to the base of Tower C, and so on. So if you can imagine a series of towers where the top of the first tower is linked to the base of the second tower, and for however many stages you need to do this. So what the warm air that is now delivered to the top of Tower B, or near the top, that causes that air to want to rise. And now the placement of that heat exchanger is fairly critical. It doesn't go right at the top, it goes some distance down. The optimal position has got to be determined by a proper study. But essentially, by warming that air at the top, you are causing that air to rise, which then drags the cold air up behind it. That cold air is now being dragged meter by meter up the inside of a hollow tube, and it is expanding and getting colder. So by the time that air reaches the heat exchanger, where we would near the top of that second tower, it is now 8 or 9 degrees colder than it was at the base. And you can repeat this process step by step. Now, obviously, I'm trying to describe something without drawings here, which is...
right. So, well, as a non-technical person, there's 2 questions that arise for me. So if you could answer them, at least the non-technical people like me might understand better.
Sure.
So one question that comes up immediately for me is, you have something at the top that's heating the air to create a kind of a suction effect to pull the
updraft, yes.
Right. So the updraft, though, that when that air gets up to the top, now it's touching on that part that's being heated. So don't you lose your advantage? So that's question number 1. Question number 2 is, when you get to a certain place of everything being cold enough, you're below freezing, so your water thing isn't going to work anymore. So what do you do then?
Yes, if you rewind back, I said let's just keep talking about water for the moment. So in North America, where you have cold winters, you have this product called antifreeze, which goes into your car radiators.
Yeah.
So essentially, a product like ethanol or glycol then gets added to the water. So ethanol has got a freezing point of around about minus 110 degrees C.
Oh my goodness. There you go.
So,
that answers that question.
So it becomes a water glycol / ethanol solution in order to depress the heating point of water. We like to use water because it has got a very high heat capacity. So you use water to the greatest extent that you can, simply because it has got a very natural high heat capacity. So it transmits, per unit of volume, it transmits more heat than most other fluids. But you don't want it to freeze, right? Yeah, so you use that problem's already been solved with antifreeze added. Okay, so the question that has to be answered is how far down from the top of the second tower do you place the heat exchanger, and how much additional heat do you have to add in order to get the updraft that you desire. So this work is hopefully going to be done in the next 2 weeks. My son, who has been included on the patent and has a relationship with Melbourne University, he's recently finished his master's and is planning on doing his PhD there in about 2 years' time. So he's plugged into the university still, and he's been published on a few things. So we are hoping that he can leverage those relationships to get someone to take a look at this. So I've been able to do some of the work. So the latch rate calculations, all of that I can do. What is tougher to model is the updraft rate. I feel like if I put several months into it, I could generate an answer that I would not necessarily have much confidence in. That this would need to be done by someone with some expertise in the field. I've been out of university for too long. I graduated in 1986. So that's 33 years ago. So I don't trust myself. And my son has got so he's got his master's in applied maths and physics. So he's had some thermodynamics work, but very little fluid mechanics.
So just let me clarify. So what you need to figure out is the amount of heat that needs to be applied at the top to get the correct amount of updraft.
Correct.
And the heat exchanger is going to be below the top because the heat exchanger would kind of be the baffle that is between the updraft of the cold air and the heated air at the top that's creating the updraft.
Correct, yes.
Correct? Okay.
Yeah, yeah. So the idea is to use ambient heat only. In other words, just ground level heat, but you would need to, whether the amount of heat harvested at the base of Tower A is sufficient to create a useful updraft, or whether you'd need a second heat scavenger to create more updraft, that is what the calculations for.
So you're trying,
yeah.
you want to use the ambient heat so that you can reduce the ongoing cost of operation?
So essentially, yeah. So what we're looking at is essentially using ambient heat only in order to avoid expending energy that is otherwise useful. Whereas ambient heat is obviously vital to the environment. We can't gain much commercial use out of it. So it's low value heat, which nature actually uses to our great advantage, right? Because when you get strong thermal updrafts, you get thunderstorms and you get precipitation, you get lightning. So
if you had a small solar panel at the top, would that generate too much heat? Is that the problem?
No. So obviously quite a bit of work has to be done in order to determine how much heat we need. But what I'm driving at is that natural ambient heat is what nature uses to generate the weather services that gives us rain and other forms of precipitation. And in effect, we're talking about domesticating an updraft, right? By actually creating a tube and using environmental heat only in order to create a permanent updraft. And the beautiful thing about this on paper, it's beautiful on paper at this stage, is that what this lapse rate is permanent. It's day and night. So as your ground temperatures drop overnight, so does the elevated temperatures. The lapse rate is a function of the expansion of gas, which is not dependent on the sun shining or the wind blowing. So effectively, these updrafts would run day and night with the same temperature differences, and for all intents and purposes, generate the same amount of useful work. And a side benefit of this, which gets very interesting, so if you picture those bottom coils, which is where the cold water is circulating through, once you get below the dew point of the air, you start condensing water out of there. Once you're approaching 0 degrees C, so after about 2 stages of this operation, you are essentially condensing all the water out of the air. So you are producing permanent condensate water streams. And just sitting in Sydney air with between 60 and 80% relative humidity, with a system that would be roughly 4 football fields in footprint, would generate about 250 million liters of water a day, which is a side benefit. That's purely that's like collateral damage or a side benefit. That is just a consequence of moving air through a cold heat exchange.
So is that excess water over what's needed to keep the system running?
So the water required to keep the system running is in a closed circuit. So once you've charged that system with water, it's sealed, and it's like your car's radiator. You don't need to add any more water.
So all the other water you get is just a gift to the desert.
That's like rain. That's like you essentially domesticated rain. I call it a rain stick. I don't know if you've seen these Aboriginal rain rain sticks where they have rice or different grains of wheat
Yes.
inside a stick making that sound. This is essentially these air tubes. You just have continuous water falling out of the air because you're below the dew point. So it would actually rain inside the tubes, but most of the water would condensate. Most of the water would condensate out of the bottom heat exchangers, but then as the air rises and cools further, you'd get additional water raining in the first couple of stages, actually inside the tubes or the updraft. So water is a side benefit, but the ultimate goal, so because we'd previously spoken and you were kind enough to forward this to Ira, who was kind enough to have a look at the idea. Ira mentioned that this notion had some similarities to an energy, a test energy plant that was completed in Hawaii, which was called, and funny enough, I'm just having a blank, it was called OTEC, Ocean Thermal Energy Conversion, where they were essentially pumping deep, cold water from the depths onto shore, and which is sitting at about 5 degrees centigrade. Hawaii's got this particular topography where you've got this volcano popping up from the ocean floor, so the deep ocean is just offshore in those Pacific atolls, and the surface water temperature is 27, 28 degrees C. So they're pumping 2 streams of water onto land and using that temperature difference to drive a gas turbine cycle using ammonia as the working fluid. It's not very efficient because you've only got a 22 degrees C temperature difference, but it was interesting enough for someone to invest millions of dollars to build a test plant. So what I'm talking about is, and what Ira noted was the similarity, is that these tall towers can be built anywhere on terra firma, or actually even in the ocean if you wanted to, go to the expense of putting them in the ocean. They could be built anywhere because the atmosphere is everywhere on Earth, and the lapse rate is everywhere where you have an atmosphere. So essentially, this can be built anywhere.
So that raises one more question, though. When we're talking about the rain coming, inside the sealed system, you have the glycol ethanol water mix,
Yes.
but the part that's not sealed, you've got water coming down, and when it gets cold enough in that tube, it's going to start freezing that water, and it's going to clog the pipe, right? So what do you do then?
Yeah, so what you got at the bottom is you've got 20 degrees C air reheating the bottom pipes. And at the top you've got relatively dry air, and you've got again water, 20 degrees C water entering the heat exchanger and leaving it. But yes, there are so with reverse cycle air conditioners, there are issues.
Oh, wait. So maybe I'm misunderstanding. I was thinking the air is getting colder and colder and colder and colder as you go. But what you're saying is it's just each time it loops through here, it gains that 10 degree, or it gets that 10 degrees colder. It's
Yes.
not that it eventually gets to minus 100 or whatever. It eventually, it just comes down.
Correct. So in each tube, you've got each tube does a certain amount of water. So when I'm talking about a tube, I'm talking about a tube where air is moving through.
Right.
And then you have water pipes, much smaller diameter water pipes that are transporting the heat through this water glycol mix up to a top heat exchanger. Now, it's going to be interesting to see. So the air, each tube only does about 10 degrees C worth of, experiences 10 degrees C worth of temperature change. And then and that's a sequential, that's an additive effect. So each tube, a series of tubes that are coupled to the next tube, a series of tubes, they're becoming sequentially colder. And the coldest parts are in the heat exchangers are right at ground level, and they're being exposed to ambient air conditions all the time. Now, there have to be design considerations in this. So let's imagine that you have 3 tubes. During your first stage, you then likely want 2 tubes for your second stage and 1 tube for your final stage. So just like a vertical spire or a pyramid has a wide base building up to an apex. Similarly, with this thermal focusing that we're talking about doing, you will, because we're starting with ambient air into all of the tubes, and we want each series of tubes to become progressively colder, we're going to have to add more and more cold water to achieve that the temperature change in the air as we get to the colder tubes. So I'm envisaging a honeycomb layout where you have hexagonal tubes with the coldest tube in the center, and then 6 tubes around that, 12 tubes around that, 18 tubes around that, and so on. That gives you the bees have already solved the problem of how can you get the most number of volume, how can you get the most efficient packing where you can get volume for the least amount of material used. And so the hexagonal or the honeycomb design works. And it also gives you this notion of having your warmest tubes on the outer layer, which is then in contact with the ambient air just outside of it. So each tube acts as each layer or circle of tubes acts as an insulating layer to the next one. So you're only seeing 10 degrees between layers. So you're not exposing very cold tubes to very warm tubes, where you then obviously you've got a great temperature difference and you're going to have a lot of heat loss.
It's like a community of penguins.
Yeah. So so the idea is to make it as cold as we feasibly want to make it to power whatever process we want. So there's the energy angle, which is the OTEC is an example of what one can do. You can add this to a regular coal-fired power station and replace the cooling towers and make a coal-fired power station much more efficient. What it means is that by lowering the temperature of condensation, you're lowering the exhaust pressure in the final turbines, and you can add additional turbines to an existing power station. So those are the sorts of implications you're looking at. So you can build a brand new power station using the OTEC example. You can make existing coal-fired or nuclear or any other thermal power station much more efficient. You
had also mentioned at one time maybe doing this in the desert and being able to get the desert to bloom, right?
Yeah. So the Sahara desert has got a relative humidity of 25 degrees C, so you could make an oasis in the Sahara. So yeah, I think I mentioned that perhaps Elon Musk, before he goes to Mars, can simulate terraforming an inhospitable environment by turning the Sahara into a garden. Would be perhaps a useful experiment to do.
Well, let's see if we can do an experiment and try to get you an opportunity to talk to Eric Weinstein. Have you listened to any of his conversations on the portal?
Yes, I have.
Did you know that he is Peter Thiel's finance guy?
I knew that as well. It'll be interesting to see if Eric would. What does Paul talks about status rockets and the hierarchy. So obviously I'm no one in the hierarchy, and whether anyone it'd be
well, Eric's most recent conversation, before the Penrose one, he had a conversation with his brother Brett.
Yes.
Where he was specifically talking about something he calls the distributed idea suppression complex, and the way that the academic world and the world of consensus science is shutting out all the innovative ideas. Now, I think what you have here is an innovative idea that shouldn't be shut out. Maybe it's not perfected yet, but certainly if this idea could be brought into the public sphere, there would be many other people that could help you outsource your problems, and the solutions could be found more quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously, in talking to people, one's thought process is crystallized as to what is the most likely route to turning a thought bubble at this time into something concrete. So the next step, so after patenting the idea, I was actually trying to give this idea away because it's too big and grandiose for a nobody like me to do anything with. And you kept saying, "Oh, are you sure you should be talking about this?" I was just trying to give the idea away, but because I'm nobody will listen to me. And then I thought, okay, so maybe registering an idea where ideas get registered and looked at is part of the process. So registering this idea with IP or Intellectual Property Australia, where our ideas get registered, is a way to get the idea looked at, right? So that was thought process number one. And then, so my son got included in this for two reasons. One is he obviously contributed to the ideas, and this honeycomb idea grew out of suggestions and questions that he asked. So, and secondly is that he has a tie-up with the academic world. As tenuous as it is at the moment, he's planning on doing his PhD and has been published. So he has a small footprint in the academic world. So we're trying to leverage that in order to get this looked at, because if the numbers, the only thing I can't calculate is the rise rate, but the rise rate determines the power output, and that's everything at the end of the day. Now, conceptually, the rise rate, there's a near infinite amount of environmental heat that one can harvest obviously for a capital outlay. But the heat is available, so the numbers have to be crunched as to how much heat. And obviously, one can boost this. You can have solar hot water panels warming a great big dam. That could be, like a giant indoor swimming pool, or just a giant swimming pool covered with insulation. Warm that up to 35 degrees C, 40, sort of bath water temperature. I think fantastically hot. Now you're sitting above ambient temperature conditions, and then that can increase the rate at which you that can increase the uplift. So we're talking about not spending money on consumables like fossil fuels or something to boost this. So if you picture a hot air balloon, they use gas to cause the balloon to uplift. Yeah, we could do that, but that gas is valuable and has got other uses, so it has an economic value. Whereas environmental heat is freely available, except for the capital outlay. So there is a capital cost. So all of those sorts of numbers need to be run. But so before we talk to Eric,
as if Eric would have any interest in talking to me.
Exactly. Before I can talk to anyone, we need to get the numbers crunched. So that is the next step, because at this stage it's just a thought bubble that is interesting. Now, it was whilst I've been in South Africa for the past month, and I was seeing Australian news from a global perspective, and so we were seeing the fires and the drought in Australia being highlighted, and there's actually been a very big political shift in Australia. So the Conservative governments here, both state and national, have all swung more towards looking at the climate change question, because the politics of it is changing. So there's a lot of political interest in Australia at the moment in trying to solve this problem. And just to go onto global warming briefly, by pulling the water out of the air and venting dry air above the structure, you essentially are solving. So we're solving a greenhouse. So we're solving global warming in two ways, really. One is assuming that this thing generates a useful amount of power. We have now got 24/7 renewable energy, which doesn't require batteries. So that's step number one. And step number two is that by extracting the water out of the air that is being passing through the structure, is we are removing the most powerful greenhouse gas known to man, which is water vapor, and we're returning that water down to the ground. So we're in effect allowing more heat to escape through the atmosphere by drying the air. Now, this sounds really sketchy. So the question that obviously immediately pops into mind is, so we're drying out the air, we're going to ruin the environment. This a single structure only handles an infinitesimally small amount of air that is that envelopes our planet. And the concern with the global warming models is that CO2 is going to warm the atmosphere up a tiny bit. Warm air holds more moisture. So we are effectively, I'm arguing that we're removing the excess moisture that CO2 is adding to the atmosphere, because it is that positive feedback that the models are, that the scientists are worried about. It's the positive feedback loop of the additional water vapor that is giving us the scary global warming. The CO2 is only adding a tiny bit of extra heat, but it's the extra water vapor coupled with that positive feedback loop. So when you look at what the scientists are saying, that is what is driving these the worrying projections into the future. So by directly harvesting that water out of the air, returning it to the ground where we actually want it, we get the service of water for direct use, and we get the added benefit that the drier air is now allowing more heat to escape out, which is mitigating global warming. Now, if we had to plaster the entire planet with these structures, you'd start having concerns about drying out the air, right? But we're a long way.
What you're removing from the air is going back into the air on the other side, isn't it? I mean, there's
correct. So by turning the Sahara into a garden, you're just adding to the water cycle, right? So the plants transpirate water back into the air, and we reharvest it. So we're essentially talking about a closed loop system. So I'm struggling to see negatives with this, but then this is my baby, and I think it's beautiful, and it may have all sorts of flaws on it, but that's for other people to point out. And at this stage, we don't know whether the baby's viable. So the next step is to check its vitals at the university to see whether it's.
I certainly think it's a beautiful baby. At least if it has the result that you hope for, it's immensely exciting.
Yeah. So obviously, seeing as you've been kind enough to allow this idea to be aired in its first public forum, I will keep you appraised of how progress goes, and if we get a positive result out of the university, I'll certainly contact you ASAP and share the good news with you. So as I say, on my laptop this works beautiful, but we've got to see whether how it looks on a proper computer. That's
right. And also, I would say to anybody watching that if there are any, I do have some watchers that are physicists and engineers and might possibly have ideas about how to perfect this, or how to figure out the rise rate and how to determine whether or not it's economically viable. Any economists that might be looking at this, anybody out there, if you have an idea, please drop a comment in the comment section and subscribe so that you'll be kept up to date when Jason comes back.
Yeah, thanks for that, Karen. Yeah, the rise rate, so I've done some Google searching for it, and not being a scholar, and I haven't actually asked, my son's left the university, I've got another son, he might be able to, but he's just started med school, so he's quite busy, to get into the scholarly articles to see whether there is a calculation that can be, that's either done exactly what we're trying to do, or that can be simply rejigged in order to do it, because going to university where people have their calendars already penciled in, I'm not entirely sure whether we're going to get an assent to do the study or not. So what
I have one more question. When the water comes back down, does it come down with enough force to, like if you had piezoelectric at the bottom, does it come down with enough force to actually create any energy from piezoelectric?
So the way I'm envisaging this is that the hydronic loop's sole function is to essentially transfer the energy from top to bottom. So you don't any mechanical devices you put in there to harvest energy out will then render the lapse rate or the uplift. It will diminish.
Yeah,
it will diminish the uplift.
Yeah.
So at the moment, I'm interested in domesticating or industrializing coal. So man has industrialized fire. We've mastered fire. This is a. I believe that this solution is we can master ice using this. As essentially driven by environmental energy, and all we're doing is we're inverting the thermal profile of the atmosphere with our heat exchangers. So we're just flipping the atmospheric profile upside down in order to get the rise rate, and essentially this machine is venting ground level heat into the atmosphere, which is we're taking ambient ground level heat, and we are taking it 1 kilometer closer to space where it wants to go anyway. So we're short-circuiting that natural process and just speeding it up ever so slightly and using that to gain an advantage, which is to bring cold conditions down to ground. So yeah, and look, this can be done by adding energy to the system. So we can have solar panel farms with big fans at the top. You can do all of that, but the minute you have solar power electricity, now it has a value. So you could say, well, why don't you just feed that straight into the grid, right? So I'm trying to use energy that has not been monetized yet, and actually monetize it in a sense by creating a sufficient temperature difference so that ultimately we've got a 70 or greater temperature difference. We can now do some real work with that temperature difference and drive an actual power station.
So I know one of the big problems with solar is the solar panels don't last forever. They have a life of like 20, 25 years. There's a big cost to disposing of them. They're not very much of it is recyclable. I guess the copper is recyclable, but other parts of it aren't. And wind farms are the same way. There's a big cost to constructing it, a big carbon footprint to the construction and the disposal and all of that. Have you thought
the fiberglass
system in terms of the construction and the disposal? Does that require a big carbon footprint to build these towers?
Well, the foundation would require concrete, like a wind turbine. The uprights, initially I envisaged them as, so the structure would be steel columns. or really pipes acting as columns, because it would be both structural and transmitting of water to the top. And that these pipes would obviously be at the nodes of the hexagons in our honeycomb structure. But I see this moving to carbon fiber tubes in the medium term. Boeing have essentially greatly increased the production of carbon fiber for the Boeing 787 Dreamliner. And Boeing's in a bit of strife at the moment, so one sees their order book falling off. So there's a spare capacity for some carbon fiber in the marketplace. So I see this as a potential use for that. Yeah, I had another idea while I was in South Africa, because obviously at the moment tall structures. So the Dubai has they've got completed the Burj Khalifa, which is just short of a kilometer high. There's a 1.3 kilometer tethered structure, which is slated for completion end of 21. And there are apparently 2 other tall towers, I think one in Saudi and perhaps another in Dubai, where they're looking at sort of 1.4, 1.5 kilometers up. So, and they're using these as office space and for living accommodation. And I'm thinking, so this structure, just to complete your question, so we're looking at concrete base, steel, carbon fiber columns. We're looking at copper and aluminium for the heat exchangers, which is fully recyclable. And the bottom of these, so between the 2 heat exchangers, I'm looking at fabric only, so the hot air balloon type fabric, because as we cool the air down at the bottom, it's going to shrink, and shrinking air inside ambient air, you get pressure differential. So you actually want a flexible envelope and not a rigid structure. But the outside of the structure will need to protect this fabric from winds and the elements. And so the thought occurred to me, well, in Dubai, they are paying big money to live in very tall structures. Instead of spending money on outside cladding, why don't you plan to turn the outside of this into accommodation units? So you actually have a residence structure housing a energy and water providing services. So you turn the outside of the structure rather from a cost into an investment for people. Because obviously, if you can live 800 meters or a kilometer up off the ground and have great views, and you're part of a sustainable development where you have your own, where you are exporting water and power, so you have your own water and power supplied, and you're exporting the balance to the surrounding, to the populace, you've actually ticked a whole lot of boxes.
So you have the honeycomb configuration in the center, and around the outside, you clad the outside with apartments, or
correct, yeah. That's
wow.
So that's the dream.
In my mind, I see what an architect could do, something like the Sagrada Familia.
Yeah.
It'd be so beautiful.
Yeah. So there you go. It's a sort of a man-made mountain. We get to live on the mountain, and this mountain, we've turned Mount Everest upside down by at the heart of it, right in the center, we've got -50 or colder. And how cold can we make it? As cold as money and engineering allows us to go.
It occurs to me that before we close, I want to tell you 2 things, because I think this is a word for you to go in with your synchronicities. I think the most important thing is that I really like about you is your humility. And because if you didn't have that humility at the base, the whole structure will turn into a gigantic Tower of Babel.
Yeah.
And humility is the prerequisite for every beautiful thing. And then the flip side of that is gratitude. So when you function filled with gratitude for everything that comes your way, the humility and the gratitude work together to create this beautiful whole. So that's my word for today.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, that's, you know, I've been accused of arrogance in the past, and I always say that, you know, when you believe something to be true, you expound it to the fullest extent that you can, because that's the way you test whether it's true or not. But thinking about arrogance is that if you believe you know something, if you believe you have the answer, well, then you stop looking, don't you? That's the end of the road.
That's right.
Arrogance closes you off, whereas humility opens you up.
Yeah.
If you're humble, you say, I don't know, and there must be better ideas out there, and it puts you into searching mode.
Yeah, Ira and I just had a conversation about that yesterday, but it won't publish until Monday.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because I haven't signed in on my own name, actually, since our last email exchange where I mentioned to you that I was back, but I didn't even go into YouTube. I've missed Eric's latest talks. I've just signed in this morning. I thought, oh, you put out a bunch, and which I haven't seen, so I've got some catching up to do. So I apologize if I haven't been.
I was on hiatus for about 6 weeks, so you didn't miss too much.
Okay, but if you haven't seen me in the comment section, it's because I've been lazy, or my focus has been directed elsewhere. And,
you're doing what's important right now, because I really think that if you can perfect this idea, it can have a lot of applications.
Yeah, and I'm going to remind you of your promise that if this turns into something that we'll talk about the synchronicity aspect of it as well, because that's actually what kept this entire thing going. So when I moved to Sydney, I hadn't seen any technical progress in this at all. So I moved to Sydney a year ago. I brought my magnets and gadolinium and my magnet book with as a talisman, almost, to say that I still believe that this answer is going to drop, which it then did. So I've got that book here with me in this little flat in Sydney. And just by the way, I'm heading back to Tasmania, back to my life as a refrigeration mechanic in about 6 weeks' time. So, and my wife will be following shortly after that. We've just got some work commitments to wrap up here, but we really Sydney's too hot for us and too many people. We're heading back to the family home in Tasmania. Although it's only us now and the cat. The kids have gone, but so. We will see how it goes. But so I want to hold you to that. If this turns into something which obviously you'll know about, because I'll let you know, it would be great to do a second interview just to talk about.
Well, if it turns into something and I get the first chance at you, maybe that's how I'll get to be famous.
Well,
it's anyway, it's fun to think about these things.
It is fun, and one has to just chuckle and smile about it. I mean, it's what did Peterson say? Look up and conceptualize the biggest thing you can possibly conceptualize. And as I say, the little clues from the universe never stopped coming, so I never gave up. And I did, but when it dropped, it wowed me. I had no idea what the answer. Obviously, I didn't know what the answer was going to be, and when it came, I thought, "Wow, that's a pretty big vision." So let's see whether it's real or whether it's a fantasy.
Well, and as Peterson says, when you speak the truth, that which comes into being as a result of speaking the truth is the best possible outcome.
Yeah.
So let's keep a pristine relationship with the truth and see what happens.
Yeah. Couldn't have said it better myself. Well done.
Okay, that's a good place to sign off.
Yeah, good. Thanks, Karen.
It's been a delight, Jason. Thank you so much for carefully explaining the idea and answering all my non-technical questions. And
Yeah. Just the final thing is I'm busy. I've finally gotten my act together, so I've got TurboCAD reloaded on my computer. I've got a website which was actually dealing with the synchronicities, which was just very small in its infancy, and as soon as this idea landed, I stopped. But what I'll do is I'll post the description that we're generating to give to the university. I'll post that on my website with the pictures, which for anyone who's interested and have struggled with my garbled explanation, I will put some pictures up there and essentially give you the same material that we're giving the universities. And I'll let you know when I've done that, and probably best to do it once we've got good feedback from the university as well. But I'll give you that link.
Yeah, when that happens, give me the link and I'll add it to the information on the web on the video. I can do that at any time.
Great, super. Karen, thanks very much. It's been
okay. Thank
wonderful
you,
talking to you again.
My best to your wife and to your beautiful daughter who is learning to do ballet, huh?
Yeah. She's my wife's going over in April to watch it's called her first ballet. This is the end of her second year where they're doing a full production and a tour around England. So I haven't seen her dance since she was 15. So
oh my goodness.
And I won't see this. My wife's going over. So I'm envious. But anyway, thanks.
Well, if you get any good photographs, send me one. I love to paint dancers.
Yeah. Okay, awesome.
Okay.
Okay, Karen, all the best.
Signing off, Jason. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.